Thank you. Thank you for your remarks. Representative McGovern, I wanted to pick up on some themes that you raised for us and explore them a bit. Like you, these issues are very personal to me. My family came to this country escaping religious persecution in India. Right now we're seeing immense persecution in India on the basis of religious difference in India as in other parts of the world. But the story I wanted to share with you all today is actually of my Uber driver yesterday. After I landed at Dulles, got in the car, got in a conversation with the driver. He's from Afghanistan, came last year just before the Taliban takeover. And he was telling me that he grew up 5 minutes from the Sikh Gurdwara there, used to spend time with the community, used to eat dinner there. And what we know now is that a few decades ago there were 200,000 Sikhs in Afghanistan. Now there are 9. Not 9,000, not 900, 9. And it's on the basis of religious persecution. And so this is what's on my heart today, as it is with many of you, with the communities you work with and serve. And part of what you raise here, and part of what we're thinking about is, when we're looking at places like Afghanistan or China or Nicaragua, Iran, we see how the privileging of a single religious community can come at the expense of other communities. And we can also see how privileging religious freedom over other human rights can lead to other kinds of oppressions and violence. And you raised this, Representative McGovern, in your remarks, and I would love to hear from you. What do you see as the antidote to these kinds of experiences we're seeing all around the world? How do we shift culture in a way that ensures that everyone in the world has the opportunity to thrive equally?
Well, that's a very, very important question, and the answer is kind of complicated. But as I said in my remarks, I mean, I do think that here in this country we can serve as an example by doing a better job of combating religious intolerance and persecution in this country. We're not doing a good enough job, quite frankly, and to those who say that, well, there's not much we can do, I disagree with that. But I think we can be a model. The second thing is we need to be more consistent in our advocacy for not just religious freedom rights, but human rights in general. I mean, I think I worry sometimes, it's not just the United States, but we pick and choose where we want to express our outrage. And oftentimes in countries where we have strategic interests or economic interests, we tend to soft pedal the abuses that are ongoing. We need to be more consistent. You know, as a member of Congress, I believe that if our government stands for anything, we need to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights. And we need to be consistent, and we are not always consistent. I think we have to do a better job of being, having the backs of those who are being persecuted and helping to uplift their cause. You know, I co-chair the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. We have a program in the commission called the Prisoners of Conscience campaign. I mean, there are many people that are arrested all over the world. They are prisoners of conscience because of their religion, and we try to give them voice. And so I think the deal is we need to be consistent, we need to be all-inclusive, and we need to use our voices to demand that things change, that we respect everybody for what they believe and who they are.
Chairman McCaul, I want to go back to something you mentioned in your remarks. And by the way, the story I heard about your arm was that I know the speaker's race was contentious, but I heard the chairman's race was even more so.
But I won.
Yeah, I see that. So I hate to see what happened on the other side. You mentioned China, and that is an area where there is clear bipartisan support. In fact, I appreciate, as the former chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, former Speaker Pelosi's outspoken support for minorities, religious minorities in China. So there's support there, but there's a growing concern with China exporting their technology and their repressive means to other countries, even in this hemisphere. Mm-hmm. So as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, what do you see going forward in a way to box China in? We know they're bad. We know they're bad on human rights, on religious freedom. but they are influencing many other countries around the globe. How does that factor into your position going forward?
Right, and if I could maybe step back, the Uyghur Muslims, it's really horrific what they're doing to them. Slave labor, when you talk about solar panels, batteries, most of that's being manufactured in the Xinjiang province, where they commit genocide. They have biometrics to follow all their people within China. Organ transplants where they force people and they sedate them and take their organs out, and it's just horrific. Some of the stories I hear coming out of the region, not to mention, Jim and I have been very involved with the Dalai Lama, Tibetan. Of course, he's was kicked out of China, and the Tibetans were as well. We know the history of Catholic priests in China. But what you're referring to is called the Belt and Road Initiative. They're in 140 countries around the world now, basically bringing their technology, their surveillance. They go into these countries, they get them into a debt trap, and they take their rare earth minerals. They bring their own workers in, and typically the countries will default on their debt. The IMF bails them out, and they get access to a port or a military base. A good example, Tony, right now in Afghanistan, China now is trying to get leases to $1 trillion of lithium rare earth minerals, and they'll probably get access to Bagram Air Base. So as we look at what happened in Afghanistan, the end result of that, to see China there is very unfortunate. But what I see also is the idea, though, that we export our technology to China that allows them to build their most advanced weapon systems. And when I talk about that, I'm talking about their hypersonic weapons, for instance. The one that can circle the globe with precision and land with a nuclear warhead. That was built on the backbone of American technology, and I think we need to stop doing this. But the oppression is real. Right now, we're looking at something I don't think we've seen since World War II, and that is the largest invasion in Europe since World War II, and now the CCP, Chairman Xi, looking at Taiwan and the Pacific Islands. They are there. They want to overthrow the election in Taiwan. They want to suppress the people there and their religious freedom in that region of the world. And of course, Putin's war crimes cannot go without a notice here. Right. Jim and I worked very hard on the war crimes bill that we got passed in the, I believe, the National Defense Authorization Bill, which is a great step forward. But the religious persecution, I think Jim mentioned the Ahmadiyya Muslims, very peaceful, loving Muslims who are persecuted in Pakistan as well. And it's just very sad to see that that's still happening in this world today.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I'd offer a question to either of you, if you'd be open to it. You invoked Putin. We're talking about China, where I think it was you, Representative McGovern, who spoke to this as a national security issue, or maybe that was you, Representative McCaul, that religious freedom is also a national security issue. I think if we're looking at what's happening in the world right now, that's absolutely true. And also there's an economic question, and I think that often plays into who are we willing to hold accountable and who are we not. And I would love to hear you reflect on what mechanisms we need in place to help ensure that we are standing up to all perpetrators of religious persecution, regardless of economic potential, in addition to the national security question.
Well, on the economic side, I think it's important that we have to compete. This is a global power competition. And you have four foreign nation adversaries, that being Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Iran and North Korea are giving drones and artillery into Ukraine against freedom and democracy in the West. I remember Reagan, one of my favorites, was such a champion for human rights. What would Reagan do in Ukraine? He would fight for the oppressed against the oppressor, I believe. And he brought down the Soviet Union for what they stood for. And that's the fight I think that we find ourselves in today. In terms of economic freedoms, we have to be present. We have to be on the field in Africa, for instance. When I talk to African ambassadors, they say, you're not here. The United States is not investing in Africa, which will be the largest populated continent in the next decade. So I think it's a question of, our American investment where, we can compete with the great power struggle. This is a struggle for the global balance of power, in my judgment. And the economic ties are just as important as the security ties as well. We have certain mechanisms, Ex-Im Bank, Development Finance Corporation, and other things to move this forward. But, Jim and I we're working on ways to move this forward, because when you lift the economic situation, like, for instance, if we could do that in Central America, would we have a migration phenomena that we see at our southwest border? I think hitting the root cause of that, because 85% are fleeing for economic reasons, some for political and some for religious freedom. But the economic conditions, if we can lift, as President Kennedy said, a rising tide floats all boats.
And I agree with what the chairman said, most of what he has just said. I would just say that, I think we need to raise the issue of human rights at every level, not just at human rights conferences, not just at conferences to talk about religious freedom, but when we're doing trade bills, when we're talking about investing in other parts of the world, that part of the condition has to be a respect for human rights. You can't persecute people because of their faith. You can't persecute people because of their gender or their sexual orientation or of their ethnicity. I mean, that has to be part of the discussion. And to be honest with you, I've been around for a long time under Democratic and Republican administrations. It's a little bit challenging when you deal with administrations because it becomes uncomfortable. And Chairman McCaul mentioned the work we did on the Uyghur Labor Force Prevention Act. I'll be honest with you, there were some powerful business interests in this country that were very much opposed to it. And it was not an easy thing to get over, the hurdle, because there were lots of economic interests entrenched on exploiting slave labor in the Xinjiang region. We were able to do it, thankfully at the end, in a bipartisan way, which is important. But let's not underestimate that there are forces who will talk the talk on human rights, but not walk the walk. And I think the challenge we all have is how do you keep constructive pressure up so that we're doing the right thing, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's an ally, even when it's somebody we have strong economic ties with. Because again, as I said in my opening remarks, if you don't, you're going to end up, the country that oppresses their people, for whatever reason, will be a country that there will be violence and instability in the long run. And so it is not in our interest to just turn a blind eye to terrible oppression.
Could not agree more with that. And I do think that there's even a role for American consumers when we look at what's coming out of China and those businesses that are exploiting those workforces. We've just got a few minutes left, and I want to throw something in here, blow everything up. I want to talk about Nigeria. You mentioned it, Chairman. When I was serving as chair of the USERV Commission, we were, for the first time after years of recommendation, able to see Nigeria listed as a country of particular concern. Congressman McGovern, you mentioned the complexities of this. There's no doubt that religious freedom is playing an issue in Nigeria. We've seen this administration pull back, saying, no, it's more of an issue of scarcity of resources. Clearly, there's an overlap. But how do we address the religious persecution, religious hostility aspect amidst the other issues, like the economic resource issues as well?
Well, it's very challenging. I mean, Africa, the Sahel is, I passed the Global Fragility Act with Lindsey Graham to stabilize that part of Africa where economic conditions are so bad that it breeds terrorism. So that's a component to this. And of course, with that, with the various terror organizations, you have that religious freedoms that are being compromised in the region. We do a lot of great things. The United States of America is such a great, powerful country. We do so many great things for other people. Global Health Fund, global malnutrition. We're going to reauthorize PEPFAR on my committee that saved 250 million people in Africa from AIDS. And so I think that when we do these things, first of all, we have to let them know this is coming from the United States of America. So we have the prestige of them knowing where it's coming from and the influence. And I think we can also influence behavior. And we don't want to put money in corrupt governance. We don't want to reward bad behavior. And so I think we do have some leverage and pressure when it comes to some of these programs that we administer, particularly in, like you said, Nigeria and Africa, to change that behavior. But it's not easy, and you have to balance that. But, this is something that Jim and I work on. I mean, it's rare you can pass a bill in Congress knowing you're going to save lives. And PEPFAR being a good example, 250 million lives. All the things we do with global health, global malnutrition, really in what I was taught as a Catholic, the life of Christ, the message of Christ, as like the missionary life. And I think we can influence the governance and behavior in those countries through those programs.
And I agree with. I can't believe I'm agreeing with my chairman on everything here. But I think, Tony, you mentioned Nigeria, and you mentioned that there are not just religious freedom issues; there are other issues as well. And I think the challenge that we have is to make sure that we address all of the issues, right? I'm thinking like what's happening in Nicaragua right now. I mean, Catholic priests that are being targeted by the Ortega regime. I mean, they're targeted not just because they're priests. I mean, the people who are being targeted are the people who are standing up and professing their faith and their allegiance to justice and fairness and human rights. And so it's not just the religion, it is also what they're standing for. Or in India, the case of Father Stan, who was, who died in Indian custody. I mean, that has been labeled as an example of persecution against Christians. I think that's true, but he was also a victim. He was arrested under these anti-terrorism laws that are being used to, quite frankly, threaten the rights of a whole range of people. Right. And so I think we don't want to underemphasize the religious freedom aspect in some of these troubled places, but we don't want to overemphasize it either, that in a way that might promote more sectarianism or that might not get to solving the real issues. But I think there's a way to do this. We have to look at this holistically, and we have to have, it's just not one thing that has to be part of the discussion. And to the extent we do that, I think we will have some success in making progress. Look, this world is a really troubled place right now. And even in our own country, we have some troubling issues and polarization and violence. There's a way out of this, and I think many of the people in this room, and as evidenced by the very diverse panel here, we probably wouldn't even agree on lunch, right? But here we are all coming together on the importance of focusing more attention on these issues and being more consistent and being more forthright and being more effective. So anyway, but thank you.
Congressman McGovern, Chairman McCaul, thank you for being with us. Simran, thank you. And would you please thank our congressman for being here and joining us?
Yeah.
Good.
Thanks.
Hey. Okay.